In summer, Corsica welcomes almost 3 million tourists, compared to an estimated winter population of 280,000. People come from all over Europe to admire the beauties of Calista, and above all to be beside this picture postcard Mediterranean coast. To many people, Corsica is a long coastline of beaches that are all different and all as beautiful as the next. This is the blue gold of Corsica, the object of all desires. Every beach, every bay, and every cove becomes a summer destination. This is the Corsica we know from postcards, and for many years, it has been the main economy of the island. The Calanque of Piana, the Gulf of Girolata, and the Gulf of Porto. There are many unique sites, and these are all World Heritage Sites. At the start of spring, the Gulf of Porto is a silence of waves and winds. Nature here looks as if it comes from the ends of the earth. The sea, the wind, and the rock. Everything here is volcanic: lava, rhyolite, basalt, and magma that erupted in fury millions of years ago. These tormented landscapes are the continuation of the Esterel Massif in the south of France. It was a long time ago when Corsica wasn't yet an island. In the Tertiary period, the final volcanic eruption happened, the massifs collapsed, and Corsica drifted away. Millions of years later, the Red Peninsula of Scandola has collected titles, becoming the most beautiful integral reserve of France and a protected marine environment. No roads, no construction, not even a path. Only a cathedral of nature, where Jean-Marie Domenici protects without any concessions.
If you like, I feel I have a mission to accomplish, and that mission is to make Corsicans and the wider world aware that we have a paradise beside the sea. And until I achieve that goal, I won't be happy. Because today, I live in a paradise. I know that. I want everyone else to be aware of that. Corsica is like the rest of the planet. It could be a paradise if it was managed in a way, you know.
These old wild rams bear witness to the history of Scandola and the shepherds who came here for the summer in the last century. The treasure of Scandola is sometimes only a flower, like this one. Armoria solaroli is unique to Scandola. It's only found in these rocks along the shoreline, a few dozen meters from the sea. It's so rare that academics from Brittany and Corta have studied it, identified it, categorized it, and finally tagged it.
It's a species that needs little substratum or soil. It has very fine roots that penetrate into the fissures of the rock, so it can draw out the minimal amount of moisture it needs to live. Because in the summer, in August, the heat of this rock can reach 40 degrees and even higher sometimes. And just a little moisture from the sea air is enough to keep it alive.
Just as rare are the Corsican erodium, or the coastal ragwort. In the spring, the peninsula is awash with color. The nature reserve of the Scandola Peninsula includes the sea as much as the land. Without the presence of humans, corals, sea fans, spiny lobsters, and shellfish have created their own underwater kingdom and prospered, along with groupers, moray eels, red mullet, sargo, and many others.
This site is where we have the largest number of groupers in the Mediterranean. There are 700 individuals spread over nearly 40 hectares. It's remarkable. These individuals weigh over 30 kilos, 30 to 40 kilos.
These are big species: barracudas, groupers, corbfish, several species of sargo, new species like the royal moray eel, Miteroperca rubra, coral. Coral is very much present in the reserve because it's a well-protected area, and we're lucky to have significant amounts of coral at accessible depths, quite shallow.
Red coral is a fragile animal of calcium carbonate. In these pure waters, it flourishes better than anywhere else in the Mediterranean, at about 10 meters below the surface. The rich biodiversity in Scandola also extends to the mysterious caves where deep-sea conditions are found. These navel shrimps can't tolerate light and usually live in the depths of the ocean at over 200 meters below the surface. For the forkbeard, these black holes are a paradise. These fish love the crustaceans which surround them in their thousands.
When the Scandola Reserve was created, the first task was to take an inventory of the marine reserve. For example, I said there are 700 groupers today. Back then in 1975, there were 4 groupers. Of course, people used to fish using explosives. Fishing wasn't controlled or regulated. That had a major impact on resources. As for the groupers, there were 5 groupers. 1 corps was observed.
On the rocky outcrops of the peninsula, the osprey comes to feed its family. The rare big bird of prey is the emblem of the reserve. The osprey was the reason for the creation of Scandola. Although it's protected, its survival is still uncertain, as in the summer the silence of the peninsula is broken. This mountainous extremity is now the flag bearer for the natural environment in Corsica. Scandola is one of the best known and most visited natural sites on the island. In summer, over 700,000 people come in boats to admire this icon of nature. The main attraction is to come as close as possible to the rocky outcrops, where the last ospreys are nesting. Disturbed as they sit on their nests, the pairs leave to find a quieter place in the Mediterranean. A victim of its fame, Scandola today is torn between complete protection, which would limit visits, and a tourist economy, from which locals make their living.
The Corsican soul is well represented here in the Scandola landscape. The torment, the stress, the fact that we haven't achieved what we should have done. We haven't achieved our future in a peaceful, paradisaical way, because this is a paradise. But the problem is that paradise is right beside us, but we can't access it. Man has certain shortcomings, which will mean we come up against this paradise. It says in the Bible or in the writings of other great people that paradise is so close that we can't see it. That's what Scandola is. Paradise is here, but we can't see it.
In bad weather, natural shelters on this tattered part of the coastline are almost non-existent. From Calvi to the Gulf of Sagone in the south, the only place for pleasure boats to shelter is the anchorage at Girolata.
Now this is Corsica again for Girolata.
Yes, Caritza, come up to the Yellow Boys and stand by at the Yellow Boys.
I have a 13.3 meter boat with a draft of 2 meters. He hasn't booked.
There's space anyway.
Okay.
This is La Costa. Shall I take the place of the catamaran or the pontoon? The pontoon is in front of you, slightly to your port side.
Jean-Francois Lucioni, the harbor master of Girolata, has spent 20 years in these mountains that end in the sea. He knows every part of them in detail.
Over there you have a peak in the shape of a pyramid. The peak is 620 meters. And there at the end of the gulf, The depth of the seabed is 800 meters. So that makes a change in level of nearly 1,500 meters over a distance of 1 kilometer. The sea pounds against these almost vertical cliffs, which are all along the coast, and so it creates a phenomenon of backwash, which sends waves back against the main waves up to several miles out to sea. So the sea is very choppy, and that makes a sort of bubbling all along the coast, and it's really very uncomfortable for sailing. Even with modern technology, even with very well-equipped boats, you're sometimes forced to stop sailing because, well, it's the sea.
In summer, when the Libeccio blows, this strong wind between the west and southwest, the sea becomes treacherous. In the south, strong winds in winter transform the landscapes. The Libeccio, the Tramontane, the Gregale, the Sirocco, the Ponente, the winds that blow over Corsica, the spray and the weather, together with the rock, make up a real mineral bestiary.
We're obviously very spoilt here with the sea. With the shoreline, we have colorful waves. Sometimes in the summer, even in the winter, it's fantastic. It's as if you're on a desert island.
These are the otherworldly landscapes that Marin seeks, those of an island that has remained really wild, protected from men, in order to endlessly admire the terrifying beauty of nature.
You can see from the mountains and rocks that it's very stormy. The wind is king here. It's able to carve out stone. It's quite mind-blowing. You can see it in all these tefoni and these geological phenomena. Lots of people, naturalists, come here to observe. They're astounded by the strength of the element against the stone and against things that appear eternal. But in the end, you realize that the wind is powerful and strong. I often say that the Strait of Bonifacio, which starts at Roccapina, is an area where the wind just exhausts you. You won't exhaust the wind even if you sail all day. The wind will exhaust you. When it starts blowing, it doesn't stop. It's quite something. This is the land of wind. On the headland, they've sometimes recorded gusts of 240 or 260 kilometers per hour, which is massive. Very often, we have hurricane-force winds, force 12 Beaufort. It blows like fury. Perhaps we've relived the experience of the sailors on the Semilant. The sea was covered in white crests, 7 or 8 meters high, everywhere. And you could see the spray running up into the Maquis. It was absolutely phenomenal. It's the Mediterranean. It has very little credibility in the wave world among surfers. They call it the bathtub because it's almost an inland sea.
Marin's dream is to live the sea, to sail alone across the Mediterranean on his windsurfer to Sardinia, to be among these elements that he's so obsessed with, the wind and the sea.
The beauty is striking. The lights, the light, the seasons. The seasons are very well defined. The scents, nature is... It's like a painting that the artist will never completely finish.
The Strait of Bonifacio is a place of danger for shipping, where so many lives have been shattered. According to legend, Odysseus battled valiantly against the winds here. His fleet of 10 ships did, however, land in front of this limestone proscenium, the high white cliffs of Bonifacio. The battle is said to have taken place here in the Strait of Bonifacio, which is now the international strait between Sardinia and Corsica. Bonifacio is the very tip of the nation, the end of French territory. The extremity of Corsica was for centuries the military center facing Sardinia, a citadel forming the border with the other Mediterranean world. Bonifacio is above all the most natural port in the whole of the Mediterranean. Powder magazines in the cliffs, chains to bar the port, fortifications right to the tip of the peninsula. Bonifacio is a fortified town where the whole area is annexed by the military. In the 1970s, this region was once again united with the creation of a marine reserve between Corsica and Sardinia for the protection of biodiversity. The jewel of this nature reserve in the Strait of Bonifacio is the Lavazzi Archipelago, a conservatory for fauna and flora specific to the Mediterranean.
If you have to sum up the richness of the Lavezzi, it would be difficult. It's a landscape, a particular geological formation that some people think is a bit like Brittany. It's a well of biodiversity both in the riches of its flowers on the land and the riches of its birds, particularly its seabirds.
These Cory's shearwaters that wail like infants nest at night under the jumble of rocks. The little albatross lands here to reproduce before returning to spend the winter at sea off the coasts of Africa. For 35 years, ornithologists from the nature reserve have monitored this bird using rings and GLS recorders, which has given them precious knowledge of this great traveler.
Write down the GLS number. In October, the birds will leave. Totally instinctively, all the birds in the nests around us will move towards the sea and all fly away. With a beat of their wings, they'll all fly off across to Gibraltar. They'll spend 2 or 3 weeks in the Mediterranean, and then they'll pass Gibraltar. We have some extraordinary data. One bird with a sensor was tracked every 48 hours. It stopped in the Balearics, and actually it waited for a depression to get a push past Gibraltar. And it ended up in the south of Morocco 48 hours later. These birds are capable of making very long journeys in a very short time, simply to migrate and to return to nest, always in the same place. We say thank you for what it's done for science. It's a poetic symbol, a symbol which intoxicates sailors, a symbol which is something quite exceptional, and it's part of our heritage. It's also a very good indicator of the state of health of the sea and of the wildlife on these islands.
Greater flamingos come from Sardinia, the Camargue, or from Turkey to spend the winter on the lagoons on Corsica's eastern plain. With over 20,000 birds, the Goulia Lagoon is the third most important lake in France by number of birds. A vast nature reserve today, until the end of the Second World War, this was an area of wetland with stagnant water and dreadful malaria. For centuries, the Piage, the beaches, were these deprived and unhealthy areas along the coast that were of no value and inherited only by women on their marriage. Coastal land has a long history, and the wildlife here reflects that.
You can feel that generations of people over centuries and centuries have lived here, worked here, and hidden here, because people often used to hide here. And for me, it's one of the highlights of life in Corsica, and I'm extremely attached to this place. And I think it's perfectly beautiful.
About 30 years ago, Francis Leandri and Fabienne Mastracci set about reopening the coastal trail that was used for centuries between Campomoro and Bonifacio. They took over a decade to uncover the trail that was paved in part by the Romans. Cutting the maquis with a machete and asking the former shepherds, they brought up to date a part of Corsica's history which was written here on this coastline, which is now an emblem of the wild natural environment.
When Francis started bringing his first clients here, there was very little remaining of the coastal trails. There were a few hunters' trails, or those of people who had animals and took them from one place to another. But the first time we left Propriano to go to Bonifacio, it was a wild gamble, absolutely wild. There were hardly any clues, unlike what you might think. The Corsicans are people of the mountains, etc. But there's a whole part of Corsica which was oriented towards a maritime way of life and maritime routes. So very often, goods were transported by sea.
This grain store, built of granite stones, is one of the last witnesses to the activity that went on here.
I've known it like this for 30 years. This house is wonderful, really wonderful. It's an extraordinary testimony. And probably the grain was stored here, because all this area around us was probably planted with wheat. It seems impossible to imagine today. Corsica was a garden. You must understand that. It was a garden that started at Bonifacio and ended up at the Cap Corse. And all these trails that we see were made in order to transport goods, and not only people, goods or animals. And now they've become a sort of emblem of the natural environment. But if the Corsicans of not even a century ago came back and heard that, it would be a terrible humiliation for them. It would mean they weren't able to maintain their land, which is the truth. I have a sworn hatred for maquis. I think it smells nice and looks pretty on a postcard, etc. I'm a farmer. The maquis is my #1 enemy. When I see this, after the aesthetic emotion, I feel a great regret because it means there are no more humans to occupy the space. The wilderness is beautiful, but we must also have our place here.
After 2 world wars, Corsica's population was so depleted that it became a holiday destination. The French state decided to develop the island's economy through its main resource, its natural capital. Major projects for tourist development first of all targeted the most exceptional nature sites on the Sanguinaire's archipelago, the Gulf of Porto, the tip of Cap Corse. Promoters dreamt up the craziest projects: a pleasure port, a heliport, a casino, hotels with over 15,000 beds. Here in this little corner of nature, a concrete jetty was once built to receive the residents of about 100 villas that a promoter wanted to build. He had already marked out the roads and access routes when one day his project was stopped dead.
He said he was a benefactor of humanity who came here because it was a pretty area and he wanted to allow 5,000 people to enjoy it. And that nasty people
Are dead.
to break this good rule of Corsican hospitality and to make the gentleman in question leave.
He was called, I can't remember. When he quietly built his house, no one bothered him. But when he decided to build a very big development, that was when he started having problems.
It's not that I'm against people building in Corsica, but there are places to build and places to dream, and I think this is a place to dream. People have been fighting for Corsica for centuries. The first Corsican revolts don't just go back to Pascal Paoli. When you talk about the resistance in Corsica, people think of the resistance in the last war. The resistance has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in Corsica, and the last members of the resistance are the people who fought and paid with years in prison, and sometimes with their life, to maintain these spaces. I know that I owe my ability to travel in these territories, which are our territories, to them. These landscapes that we see now are magnificent. These 3 days that we spend by the sea, it's because people paid with their life and their freedom that we can offer you that privilege. If those people hadn't existed, there would probably be a major crossroads here. Probably a Leclerc, casino, or Carrefour supermarket, cafes. There would be people everywhere, police cars, fire engines, because people would have car crashes, do you understand? And at some point, Corsicans committed themselves, so that would not happen here. But for me, someone who fights for their land is a man and a real Corsican.
How do you reconcile nature and tourism on such a fragile island? How can it be developed without losing its soul and without damaging the landscape? The coastline is at the heart of all the questions being asked about Corsica today.